The diamond bracelet caught the light as it flew across the table, and in that frozen moment before it clattered onto marble floor, Catherine Hayes knew her carefully constructed invisibility was about to shatter. For months earlier, Le Jardin Étoile occupied the entire top floor of Chicago's Apex Tower, a restaurant so exclusive that its waiting list stretched 2 years, and its average dinner bill exceeded most monthly car payments. Crystal chandeliers from a dissolved French chateau hung above tables dressed in Italian linen, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Lake Michigan that looked like paintings of themselves. The air smelled of truffle oil, aged burgundy, and the particular silence that only $800 entrees could buy. Catherine Hayes moved through this temple of wealth like a shadow, her 27-year-old frame swimming in the regulation uniform, starched white shirt, black vest, black trousers with creases sharp enough to cut. Her auburn hair was scraped into a bun so tight it pulled at her scalp, revealing a face that had aged a decade in 6 months. Exhaustion lived in her posture, the microscopic tremor in her hands as she balanced champagne flutes, the careful way she shifted weight off her swollen feet, the dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She was 5 months pregnant. The slight swell of her belly was just beginning to show beneath the vest. She had been standing for 9 hours already, her shift having started at 11 that morning. Tomorrow she would do it again. And the day after. Because her husband, former husband, she corrected herself bitterly, had made certain she had no other choice. 8 months ago, Catherine had been Catherine Marlowe Hayes, wife of Julian Marlowe, founder and CEO of Marlowe Capital Holdings, a private equity empire valued at $4.2 billion. Julian himself was worth $1.8 billion according to Forbes, a figure he'd referenced often during their marriage, usually when explaining why his time was more valuable than hers. They had lived in a Gold Coast penthouse worth $12 million, attended galas where champagne cost more per bottle than Catherine now earned in a week, and maintained the careful fiction that their marriage was a partnership rather than an acquisition. Then Catherine had gotten pregnant. Unplanned, unwanted, at least by Julian. She had made the mistake of being happy about it, of imagining that perhaps a child might soften the cold, transactional nature of their relationship. Julian's response had been immediate and surgical. Divorce papers delivered by his attorney, accompanied by a prenuptial agreement she'd signed 5 years earlier that left her with nothing. No alimony, no property settlement, no access to the accounts that bore her name, but had always been his money. The child is your choice, his attorney had explained in a conference room that cost $800 per hour. Mr. Marlowe is not interested in fatherhood. He will not contest custody, but he will also not provide support. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. She had been escorted from the penthouse by security that same afternoon, permitted to take only her personal belongings. Her own family was gone, her parents dead in a car accident during her junior year at Northwestern, where she'd been studying art history before meeting Julian at a university fundraiser. She'd dropped out to marry him, believing his promises about supporting her education. Now she had no degree, no family, no money, and a baby due in 4 months. Le Jardin Étoile had hired her because Gerard, the head sommelier, had a kind streak, and because her desperation had been visible enough to inspire pity. She'd lied about her education, about her references, about everything except her ability to carry heavy trays and smile through humiliation. Tonight, the restaurant glittered with Chicago's elite. At table 12 sat Margaret Ashford Kent, wife of real estate magnate Thomas Kent, dripping in Harry Winston diamonds and Chanel. She was 48 but maintained. Through aggressive intervention, her face frozen in perpetual surprise, her body whittled to the sharp angles that very rich women seemed to prefer. Her net worth, through marriage, exceeded $600 million. She was dining with 3 similarly preserved women, their conversation a symphony of complaints about contractors, vacation homes, and staff incompetence. Catherine was refilling water glasses when she heard her name. Not Catherine, her married name. I'm telling you, it's her. Margaret's voice carried across the quiet restaurant. Catherine Marlowe, Julian's ex-wife. She pronounced ex-wife like a social disease. Catherine's hand trembled, water sloshing dangerously close to the glass rim. She set down the pitcher carefully, willing herself to become even more invisible. The one he divorced for getting pregnant? One of Margaret's companions leaned forward eagerly. God, what a disaster. I heard she tried to trap him with the baby. That's exactly what happened, Margaret said with absolute authority. Julian told Thomas the whole story. She got pregnant deliberately, thinking she could secure her position. When he saw through her scheme, she turned vengeful. Tried to squeeze him for millions in the divorce. Of course, the prenup protected him. He's not stupid. Catherine stood frozen 3 feet away, the water pitcher slick in her sweating palms. Every word was a precision-guided lie, but refuting them would mean revealing herself, and revelation meant losing the only income keeping her and her baby housed and fed. Look at her now, Margaret continued, her voice dripping with performative pity. Working as a waitress, pregnant and alone. It's almost tragic if she weren't such a grasping little. The pitcher slipped. Catherine caught it, but the movement drew Margaret's attention. Their eyes met across 3 feet of expensive air, and recognition flared in Margaret's face like a match strike. Oh my God, Margaret breathed. It is you. The restaurant's ambient noise, the delicate clink of crystal, the murmur of cultivated conversation, seemed to dim as Margaret Ashford Kent's words hung in the air. Catherine stood perfectly still, the water pitcher clutched in both hands, her face carefully blank despite the blood draining from her cheeks. Margaret's expression transformed into something predatory and delighted. She turned to her companions with theatrical excitement. Ladies, you're not going to believe this. Our waitress is Catherine Marlowe, Julian Marlowe's ex-wife, the one I was just telling you about. The 3 women swiveled to stare at Catherine with naked curiosity, their faces showing various degrees of schadenfreude and pity. Diners at neighboring tables had begun to notice the disruption, conversations pausing as attention shifted toward table 12. How unfortunate, one of Margaret's friends said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. Her gaze dropped to Catherine's stomach, to the slight swell barely visible beneath the vest. And pregnant, too. How far along are you, dear? Catherine's throat felt like sandpaper. Gerard was across the room, oblivious to the developing crisis. She could walk away, retreat to the kitchen, but that would mean abandoning her section and likely her job. She forced words out. May I get you ladies anything else? Oh, don't be shy, Margaret cooed, her voice syrupy with false kindness. We're not judging. Well, not much, anyway. She laughed, and her companions joined in. I'm just surprised to see you here. I would have thought Julian would have been more generous in the divorce. He's always been so charitable. The lie sat between them like a grenade. Catherine's fingernails dug into the pitcher handle. She knew what Margaret was doing, testing her, probing for reaction, turning her humiliation into dinner theater for bored socialites. The divorce settlement was in accordance with our prenuptial agreement, Catherine said quietly, each word carefully neutral. Oh, the prenup. Margaret clasped her hands together. Of course. How sensible of Julian. You know, I always tell young women, never sign a prenup unless you're absolutely sure about the marriage. But I suppose you thought you were sure. Her eyes glittered. How long were you married? 3 years. 4. 5. 5 years, and you walked away with nothing. Margaret shook her head in performative sympathy. That must be so difficult. Especially now, in your condition. Is Julian at least helping with the baby? Providing child support? Catherine's silence was answer enough. Margaret's smile widened. He's not, is he? Oh, honey, that's just. She trailed off, letting her friends fill the silence with murmured sympathies that sounded more like gossip fuel than genuine concern. One of the women leaned forward. I heard you tried to get money out of him during the divorce. That you claimed you deserved half his assets even though you'd signed a prenup. That's not true, Catherine said, her voice low but firm. I never contested the prenup. I never asked him for anything. That's not what we heard, Margaret said lightly. But I suppose these things get distorted. Either way, it's just so sad to see you here. Working on your feet, pregnant, serving people who were once your peers. She picked up her wine glass, examining it critically. Actually, this Chardonnay is slightly too warm. Could you bring me a fresh glass? With ice this time. It was a deliberate power play. The wine was perfect. Catherine had watched the sommelier pour it herself. But Margaret was establishing dominance, forcing Catherine to perform servitude. Catherine took the glass without a word and turned toward the bar. Behind her, she heard Margaret's stage whisper, It's really quite pathetic. She had everything and lost it all because she couldn't keep her legs closed. The words hit like a physical blow. Catherine's vision blurred, her hands shaking so violently she had to set the glass down on a service station before she dropped it. She pressed her palms against the cool marble surface, breathing through the wave of humiliation and rage. A hand touched her shoulder. Gerard had materialized beside her, his expression grave. "I heard," he said quietly. "You don't have to go back to that table. I'll reassign it." Catherine wanted to accept, to retreat, to hide. But she thought of her rent, $1,400 for a studio apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were ambient noise. She thought of her baby, growing inside her, dependent on her ability to endure. She thought of the $847 in her checking account, and the $3,200 she still owed to the obstetrician. "No," she said. "I'll handle it." She poured a fresh glass of Chardonnay, added ice that would ruin it, and walked back to table 12 with her head high. Margaret accepted the glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, dear. You know, I really should tell Julian I saw you. He'll be fascinated to know how you're doing." She paused. "Actually, he's hosting a gala next week. Here, in this very restaurant. For the Children's Medical Foundation. Isn't that ironic? He's raising money for sick children while his own child." She gestured at Catherine's stomach. "Well, I'm sure he has his reasons." The information landed like acid. Julian would be here, in this space, surrounded by the world they'd shared while Catherine served champagne to his guests. Margaret watched her face, clearly hoping for a breakdown. Instead, Catherine smiled, a real smile, small and cold. "I hope you enjoy your evening, Mrs. Ashford Kent. Please let me know if there's anything else you need." She walked away with steady steps, but her mind was racing. Next week. Julian would be here next week. And suddenly, Catherine Hayes realized she had 7 days to decide whether to remain invisible or to remind her ex-husband exactly what he'd thrown away. The gala filled Le Jardin Etoile with Chicago's most powerful politicians, tech founders, old money dynasties, all gathered to write tax-deductible checks for sick children while drinking wine that cost more than pediatric medications. Julian Marlowe stood at the center of it all, devastating in a Tom Ford tuxedo, his dark hair silver at the temples in a way that magazines called distinguished. At 49, he looked like money incarnate. Patek Philippe watch, Berluti shoes, the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no, without immediately hiring lawyers to change the answer. Catherine moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne, her pregnant belly now impossible to hide beneath the uniform. She had spent the week battling with herself, call in sick, request a different assignment, anything to avoid this moment. But something stubborn had hardened inside her, something that refused to let Julian Marlowe erase her existence. She watched him work the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations for his philanthropy. He was with someone new already, a blonde in her late 20s wearing Valentino and diamonds, laughing at his jokes with the practiced enthusiasm of someone auditioning for the role of second wife. Margaret Ashford Kent was there too, holding court near the windows. When she spotted Catherine, her face lit up with malicious glee. She whispered something to the woman beside her, and Catherine felt the ripple of attention spread through the crowd like poison in water. Then Julian saw her. She watched the recognition hit him, confusion first, then shock, then something harder as his eyes dropped to her stomach. He went very still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his mouth. Margaret materialized at his elbow. "Julian, darling, have you seen who's serving tonight? It's Catherine. We had her at our table last week. Such a sad situation, pregnant, working as a waitress. I told her you'd be here tonight. I hope that's not awkward." Julian's jaw tightened. He handed his glass to his date and walked toward Catherine with long strides, his expression thunderous. She stood her ground, tray balanced, as he stopped 2 feet away. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was low, controlled, but vibrating with fury. "Working, Julian. Some of us have to. Don't." The word was sharp. "Don't play the victim. You signed a prenup. You knew what you were agreeing to. I signed it because you told me marriage was about trust, not money. That we were partners." Catherine's voice was steady despite the eyes watching them. "Turns out you meant I was the junior partner. You got pregnant to trap me." Julian's accusation was loud enough that nearby conversation stopped. "You thought a baby would override the prenup? that I'd pay to make the problem go away. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest. The last fragment of hope that perhaps he'd been misled, that perhaps Margaret's lies had poisoned him against her. But no, this was his narrative, his truth. I got pregnant because birth control fails sometimes, she said quietly. I didn't trap you. I loved you. Love. Julian's laugh was acid. You loved the lifestyle. The penthouse, the cars, the credit cards. Don't pretend this was ever about anything else. The crowd had formed a loose circle around them now, pretending not to watch while hanging on every word. Catherine felt the weight of their judgment, their fascination with her humiliation. Then she felt something else, a flutter in her belly, the baby, moving, reminding her why dignity mattered, why she couldn't let Julian's narrative become the only truth in the room. You're right, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I did love the lifestyle. I loved feeling safe for the first time since my parents died. I loved not worrying about rent or groceries. I loved being able to buy books without checking my account balance. She met Julian's eyes. But I also loved you. I loved the man I thought you were, generous, kind, someone who believed in building a life. Together. I was wrong about that part. This is inappropriate, Julian hissed. You're making a scene at a charity event. A charity for sick children, Catherine interrupted. How much are you raising tonight, Julian? $500,000? $1 million? That's generous. That's wonderful. Those children deserve medical care. Her hand moved to her stomach. So does this child. Your child, who you've decided doesn't exist because acknowledging him would be inconvenient. That's not fair. You're worth $1.8 billion. Catherine's voice was steady, almost conversational. You could write a check right now that would cover this baby's entire childhood, medical care, education, everything, and you'd never notice the money was gone. But you won't, because the prenup gives you legal protection to walk away, and you care more about being legally right than being morally decent. Julian's face had gone red. I don't owe you anything. You made your choice when you got pregnant. I made my choice, Catherine agreed. I chose to keep the baby, even though I knew it meant poverty. Even though I knew it meant losing everything. I chose my child over money. What did you choose? The silence was absolute. Julian opened his mouth, closed it. Around them, the crowd's expression had shifted, no longer entertained, but deeply uncomfortable. Several women had tears in their eyes. Then someone started clapping. Slowly, deliberately. Catherine turned to see Thomas Kent, Margaret's husband, stepping forward. He was 72, white-haired, built like a bear in a tuxedo. Young man, he said to Julian, his voice carrying across the room. I've known you for 15 years. Done business with you. Respected you. But this, he gestured at Catherine. This is beneath you. This woman is carrying your child, working herself to exhaustion because you hid behind a legal document. That's not shrewd business. That's cowardice. Margaret clutched his arm. Thomas, don't. Be quiet, Margaret. Thomas shook her off. I heard what you said about Mrs. Marlowe last week. All lies. All vicious gossip. He turned to Catherine. Ma'am, I apologize for my wife's behavior. And I apologize for not speaking up sooner. Julian's face had gone from red to white. He looked around the room, seeing for the first time how the crowd was watching him, not with admiration, but with judgment. He struggled for words. I was protecting myself. My assets. Your ego, Thomas finished. We all know about prenups, son. Most of us have them. But we also know the difference between protecting assets and abandoning responsibility. He pulled out his checkbook. Mrs. Marlowe, I'm writing you a check for $100,000 for your baby's medical care. It's not charity. It's an investment in basic human decency. Thomas, you can't. Margaret's voice was shrill. I can't, and I am. He scrawled the check and handed it to Catherine, whose hands shook as she accepted it. I'm also hiring you as a cultural consultant for Kent Properties. $120,000 salary, full benefits, immediate start. We need someone with your education background for our museum development project. I remember when Julian used to brag about your art history expertise. Seems wasteful to have that talent carrying champagne trays. Catherine stared at the check, at Thomas, her throat too tight for words. Around the room, other voices rose. I'll match that donation. My firm is hiring. Julian, this is disgraceful. Julian stood frozen as the room turned against him, his philanthropic gala transforming into a referendum on his character. His date had disappeared into the crowd. Margaret looked stricken. Finally, he pulled out his own checkbook with shaking hands. "Catherine, I'll provide child support, full support, and medical care." And his voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was cruel. I can't take that back, but I can try to make it right." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. The man she'd loved was still there, buried under layers of ego and fear. But he was also the man who had needed public humiliation to find his conscience. "Write the check," she said quietly. "Set up a trust for the baby. But don't ask for custody. You had 9 months to step up. You chose not to. That's not something money can fix." Julian nodded, his face crumbling. He wrote the check, $500,000, and handed it to her with hands that trembled. Catherine took it, then removed her serving vest and set it on a nearby table. "Gerard," she called across the room, "I quit. But thank you for treating me like a human being when no one else would." She walked out of Le Jardin Étoile with her head high, her hands full of checks that meant her baby would be safe, her future secure. Behind her, the gala dissolved into uncomfortable silence. 6 months later, Catherine gave birth to a healthy boy in a hospital room paid for by insurance from Kent Properties. She named him Thomas, after the man who had reminded her that wealth didn't have to mean cruelty. Julian sent gifts, expensive, impersonal, but never asked to visit. Catherine didn't mind. She had learned that family wasn't about blood or money. It was about who showed up when you needed them. And she and her son were going to be just fine.